Hello again there, everyone. This is the ninth and final part of a series of essays I set out to write a year ago, all of which have been intended as part of a process of looking into what happened to the discourse around Star Wars Episode 8, The Last Jedi, after it was released. From everything I've seen, the majority of the negative reaction to Star Wars in fandom spaces seems to have been concentrated in particular online communities and been increasingly produced in advance of the production of the films, shows, and even games. All it takes these days is for something to be announced for it to get hate. And if there's even the wrong mixture of ethnicities on screen, or if there's a slightly irregular aesthetic, a trailer itself is evidence of how Star Wars is over, it's dying, and so on. I think you have to be really shielded by your own biases in order to just see a whiff of a hint of a prospect of an idea of a debut of a thing and react that hard against it. I think it would be one thing to be skeptical while being excited. I mean, after all, that kind of attitude is pretty representative of how consumer protection practices work, right? A lot of these videos and posts and threads about the material seem to operate on opening weekend movie review logic. They react as quickly as possible to capitalize on a trend, and most of what they discuss is at most intended as a one-to-one representation, a kind of summary and reaction to the surface-level contents of the media itself. I'm sure to some people that sounds like I'm trying to be a hater, but I'm not. I don't intend that description to be loaded, I intend it to be as factual as possible. It's understandable that fans will watch videos when the video is trending, or when it's about a trending topic, and similarly, it is understandable that content creators will pursue those trends, or if they don't, that they will at least benefit from them incidentally when interests overlap. I don't think anyone who chases content trends is some kind of grifter, especially if they're acting in earnest. The reason I bring this up is because it does actually remind me of how lots of film reviews used to work. You'd think about going to the movies on the weekend and you'd check the paper to see how things got reviewed, and that might convince you to spend the money or not. It was a pretty simple deal, and it was still possible to read some snappy and well-written material in that format. However, as discussed previously, at a certain point articles and videos made for the internet carried over a number of the norms of print media, and those norms have been perpetuated and transformed over time. If you took that kind of material and tried to parlay it into a YouTube video essay, you might get views and you might not, but either way, as an essay it would suffer because you wouldn't be using the additional space of the essay format with intentionality. You aren't just advising someone as to whether they should consume a product when you review it weeks, months, or even years later. You're developing public discourse around a piece of art. By necessity, this makes it harder to be definitive, and there's no longer a yes or no question attached to the review, with the exception of things that require potentially significant time investments, like books or video games. It's hard to say what the purpose of a YouTube video essay should be. Does it have to be educational? Does it have to be totally scripted, word for word, and read aloud? Is it not an essay if there's no script? Does it have to consist of edited clips, or can it use only a small number of still images? If it uses only one still image, is it now a podcast? The lines are a little blurry. I've been thinking of what the best way to engage with and create video essays might be, even for a lo-fi solo YouTuber. I don't just want to diss the opinions of others. Like I said earlier, I really did set out to learn about the discourse around this film, because it was genuinely interesting to me. Of course, not all of these videos are video essays as such, but I do get the sense that for at least some of them, the consumption of them by audiences goes hand in hand with the YouTube film and game review essay genre, and so I think situating them in that context is at least marginally helpful. The first video of this series looked at a more general review by Shadiversity that he recorded in an off-the-cuff format, ostensibly discussing the qualities of The Last Jedi that he felt so negatively about. A significant amount of his review was targeted towards The Force Awakens, which is interesting for 3 reasons. The first and most obvious is that it would at least be an intriguing thesis to propose that the real problem with where The Last Jedi ended up is what came before. I could imagine myself enjoying a video like that. However, it's odd that this sort of covert thesis is exclusive to the proposal that The Last Jedi is somehow uniquely awful or otherwise more fundamentally flawed in some exceptional capacity, and those views are very prominent in discussions of this film to the degree that it was part of what provoked me to want to write about the discussions around the film. Shad also said a couple things that we looked at in that video, which seemed to reveal that, at least in his capacity as a critic, he doesn't have a strong grasp on writing and storytelling. Feel free to check that video out if you're interested. The second video in the series was a look at The Critical Drinker and his commentary on the film, with special attention paid to his remarks about Luke Skywalker. There's a kind of tone that comes through in this video that felt relevant to some of the others, especially the later ones. But I tackled it early on because how to write about heroes and heroism is very much its own topic that deserves its own space. Given that space, the conspicuous element of this part of the discourse is the very serious expression of paranoia at the prospect of emasculation, especially through expressions of weakness, flaws, or juxtapositions with female strength. From there, we started talking genre by looking at the Unbridled Rage video Mahler had made about this film, and what I thought it added to the cultural commentary around the film. Something you hear a lot about this guy is that his videos are too long, but I always figured that was more of a feature than a bug. Sometimes people want to turn on a long video and mostly listen through it. The content of the videos in this series is really what matters to me. And to avoid this, I chose a shorter video from a series he made that I've often heard people refer to as having a more comedic tone, and I tried to approach it as a sincere but also tongue-in-cheek commentary for the purposes of thinking about what a rage review really is. And this continued into the fourth video in this series, where we looked at the norms of the rage review. I think Shadiversity and a number of creators have succeeded in this space, in part because of the norms of that genre. Shad has the ability to bloviate through more or less any topic, despite total ignorance, because what he is communicating well is the tone of the video. I also drew on what I learned watching the Mahler video when I wrote the fifth video responding to Robot Head, because I wanted to ask which perceived flaws in a film draw our attention and how. It seems to me that another conspicuous element of the discourse around this film, and something that has carried over into many other discourses, is the new and evolving kind of reasoning in media analysis discourse in these communities. I developed a couple terminologies myself while looking for existing language that might help to describe what I saw happening here, two of which I thought were important enough to include as headers in the video intros. One of these was extra-narrative empathetic displacement, a phrase I mulled over while trying to come up with the language that prescribes how the perspective involved in presenting an idea can warp the audience's experience of that idea when the connection between the audience and perspective breaks down. For example, if an audience hates a character but fails to distinguish between the character and the actor, then they may direct that hatred towards the actor. And at the opposite end, if an audience insert character experiences an event in the film a certain way, but the audience fails to connect with that audience insert, they may actually redirect the experience they shared with that character onto that character instead. More on this later. Another concept I developed for this series was what I called holdo maneuvering, a sort of cheekily named way to pin down the kind of reasoning on display in fan spaces, where on the one hand, a certain event in a film deviates from established rules without express explanation, but on the other hand, that event as a new event cannot establish a new idea by first visually introducing it without violating that self-same rule, such as occurred with the so-called holdo maneuver in the film. I thought this kind of reasoning was noteworthy because, among other things, it displays a kind of blind traditionalism and ignorance to the visual language of cinema. I also used a few existing concepts, such as the word setsuna for the smallest unit of time, just something an old Buddhist philosophy professor got stuck in my head years ago, as well as the concepts of morally didactic readings and Poe's law. These helped me see how focusing on moment-to-moment analysis can avoid confronting the possibility that analysis might be internally contradictory, how a culture prone to choosing to see the presentation of an act or idea as condoning the act or idea, and how the genre of the rage review might have curated a genuinely toxic online culture of rage farming without any special intentionality. Of course, there actually has been intentionally seeded toxicity poisoning these discourses. In a research paper by Dr. Morton Bay, the author collected 967 tweets, directly tweeted at Rian Johnson, the director of The Last Jedi, and analyzed them with the user's stances on the film and openly advertised political leanings in mind. Accounts that frequently tweeted political messages and accounts that had identifying information suggesting they were real people and not trolls or bots were contrasted with their opposites. The author also employed established techniques for filtering out Russian bot and disinformation planning. Overall, 206 of the 967 tweets were negative, roughly 1 in 5, but of those negative tweets, about half were politically motivated or not real people, being either bot accounts or sock puppet accounts. The latter outnumbered the former 3-1. About a third of those sock puppet accounts were identified as Russian disinfo troll accounts. These characteristics were not reflected among the statistically collectively more numerous positive and neutral tweets. Of the politically motivated negative tweets, many use pejoratives like social justice warrior, or spoke favorably of Donald Trump, or even the National Rifle Association. My favorite of these reads, quote, "If you can't see the TLJ was basically the woman's march in space, then I have to believe you also have an agenda." The positive-negative split also had gendered implications, where 108 explicitly female accounts tweeted positively about the film, whereas only 5 tweeted negatively. The paper also mentions Kelly Marie Tran's infamous decision to quit social media over the negativity. The author says that, quote, "Based on the findings in the present study, it is not fair to generalize and paint all of the Last Jedi detractors as alt-right activists, racists, or misogynists. However, the findings above show that a majority of the negatively poised users included in the study do express such sentiments, either in the Last Jedi-related tweets or in other tweets on their accounts. These identity-based political values combine with traditional party politics and issue-based politics to represent a politicization of Star Wars critique, which is found in more than half of the negative accounts in this study." The author remarks on the discourse about the supposed politicization of the film and of Star Wars generally, saying that, quote, "With respect to those individuals who express right-wing political views on their Twitter accounts and who dislike The Last Jedi, I argue that the findings show indications of classic cognitive dissonance leading to attitude change, as described by Festinger, 1962. There is a close similarity between being a fan or supporter of a political figure and participating in pop culture fandom. Sandvoss 2013 and Wilson 2011 show how the same psychological mechanisms are in place for both these types of engagement, and that there is a strong link between supporting a particular political viewpoint and the expectation of it to be respected, represented, or even amplified in pop culture fandom. When these expectations are not met, cognitive dissonance can occur, and I argue that for many of the fans in the political agenda category, this is in fact the case. The perceived politics of The Last Jedi are in conflict with some fans' perception of Star Wars as family entertainment devoid of politics, which was never the case. The realization that Star Wars takes up a position that is left of center seems to have created much dissonance in the minds of some fans of Star Wars with a right-of-center political orientation. But rather than confront the well-documented fact that Star Wars has always leaned left, they instead change their beliefs, convincing themselves that, in fact, Star Wars was never left of center or feminist until Rian Johnson made The Last Jedi and Kathleen Kennedy was put in charge of Lucasfilm post-Disney acquisition. In a significant number of the tweets analyzed, these fans blame Johnson, Kennedy, and Disney, sometimes collectively, sometimes as individuals, for the supposed leftist feminist turn in the Star Wars franchise. There's more to be said on the politicization of Star Wars, but that will have to come later. In the back half of these videos, I looked at Jeremy Griggs of Geeks and Gamers in Part 6, who is one of the few people I felt compelled to call a true blue grifter. However, what really called to me when watching his videos is what a strong and naked case of bad faith critique he produced in multiple instances. A lot of people use bad faith as a shorthand for uncharitable, and I guess I can see why. Bad means negative, and faith makes it sound like negative faith, or a lack of faith in something or someone, which effectively means a lack of charity. It's wrong, but it's an understandable mistake. Bad faith criticism is actually something different entirely. If someone is arguing in bad faith, they are either affecting a posture which is meaningfully distinct from their true position in order to be evasive, or they are intentionally sticking out a position they don't hold to bait engagement they think they can win as opposed to one they cannot, or alternatively, they are displaying a kind of falsity or inauthenticity of which they themselves are convinced, but which is not truly representative. The thing about bad faith behavior is that it's characteristic of other social behaviors too, and right-wing or reactionary ones at that. Bigotry often doesn't stand up to scrutiny. If the moral direction of our larger society is to be, by political or social pressure, bent back to submit to its Burkean little platoons, such as they are, then a great degree of deception becomes necessary, even self-deception. It is therefore no surprise that the most outright deceitful content, as opposed to implicitly misleading or merely false, appears in the final videos. The 7th part looked at a video by the channel Mr. Reagan, and I think the sense I was getting in some earlier videos that this content had at least a partial right-wing bent really didn't need any data to confirm it because stuff like this already exists. The pervasive paranoia around female competency and male fears of inadequacy wasn't just something coloring the Critical Drinkers video, it was totally blatant in Mr. Reagan's video in every sense, where he talked about male and female characters interacting. I don't like calling people tourists because I don't think there's anything wrong with being new to something, but the suspicious number and degree of the mistakes in his video drove home the idea that this was his attempt to clumsily slot his political narrative into discussions around the film. The only interesting thing about that was how seemingly apposite his commentary was to the rest of the commentaries we looked at. And finally, in the 8th part, we looked at some commentary from one Ben Shapiro. Oddly enough, he did much of what Shadiversity did, which is refer back repeatedly to The Force Awakens, in one case even seeming to say that part of the plot of The Force Awakens occurred within The Last Jedi when it verifiably did not. Ben had a lot of the same weird energy around political messaging, including a special sensitivity towards female characters, and in one case this resulted in discussion of what exactly constitutes a Mary Sue and how the character of Rey would or wouldn't fit different elements of that label. Ben's video allowed for me to continue a previous elaboration on reactionary thought, and I tried to tie it back to the arts and how our social landscape has been receiving them and has been transformed by them. This is an ever-evolving topic about which I am dedicated to continuing to learn, so I imagine I'll have more to say eventually, but I wanted to end things here where our discussion of material about The Last Jedi is concerned. I promise if I ever make an unprovoked video about this film again, it will be about the film itself, actually discussing its contents on their own terms. The reason I've paid so little attention to defending the film in this video series was initially that I didn't really care if other people liked it. I always said that the point here is how conspicuous it is that so many of these criticisms are based on poor reasoning and a lack of familiarity with the arts, given how widespread and commonplace they are as talking points. But over the year I spent watching, reading, and writing in preparation for talking about this online cultural phenomenon, I developed another reason to neglect the majority of the contents of the film in the context of my videos about The Last Jedi. The truth, the real truth, is that the vast majority of these videos about The Last Jedi are also not about the film itself. They are about something else entirely. That prospect is the most true for the audience, who by all accounts will sit down to hear a content creator talk about the film. However, the content of the videos themselves are more about the imaginations, the desires, the fixations, the cultural biases, and the ideologies of the people who made them and who view them. I recently had occasion while spending a couple of months quietly mulling over how to end this video series, to sit and listen passively to a number of videos about online misinformation. It was something that, in addition to a few other very meta-level conversations I've witnessed over the past couple years about YouTube, really got me thinking about what I was doing here and why it mattered. Content creators often bemoan the impossibility of correcting misinformation using the same medium as the misinformed. Social media is not kind to nuanced, humanizing rhetoric, and in fact, does everything it can to at least incidentally strip us of that rational impulse. We turn on each other when we should be helping each other. Neighbors become adversaries, and before you know it, we're all fighting fire with fire. It's soothing to know that you're in the right, but that's also an experience everyone gets, and not always authentically. Why do people seek out and propagate misinformation online? This question has been asked so many times that many of you could probably answer it adequately without any feedback from me. No, it wasn't a new answer to an old question that surprised me recently, but rather a new way of thinking about the old answers. We like to be validated in our feelings. We like to be affirmed in our beliefs. We seek out those social experiences which affirm these things, and we engage with the new social experiences through those filters. I had been tempted to make this essay yet another response, to nail down one more set of ideas using outside examples. Later, I felt tempted to specifically carve out a section of this essay about the idea of objectivity in art. The idea that the meaning or general quality of a film can be objective in some sense, and exactly how and why that is not possible. Maybe you could tell from previous videos. I've already implied that qualitative assessments or value judgments imply perspectivity, and all perspectivity is subjectivity, so there are no objective value judgments. There is no objectively good or bad art. I was even going to draw up a visual metaphor and use a mathematical idea, like I did in that silly little The Curtains Are Blue essay. I could tell you to imagine a globe, a three-dimensional sphere that can be viewed from any direction. I could then ask you to imagine graphing lines of longitude and latitude onto the globe, picturing its equator and prime meridian. If all lines are infinitely divisible two-dimensional objects, then all three-dimensional objects can be viewed from infinitely divisible points of intersecting longitude and latitude. If that's the case, the object can be viewed from infinite perspectives, despite otherwise seeming to possess definite characteristics. We can similarly take new perspective after new perspective on art and generate meaning discursively. But we can never get to the bottom of all meaning, and we can never have an omniscient combination of all perspectives. The objectivity we can access is comparably limited in the meaning it can produce, and the objectivity we can't access would require us to be God. I thought about all of that, and I even thought about reworking it into its own video. I really did. But like with the rest of all this, the early question proved to be the least interesting one. I stopped being interested in how one particular side of those objectivity and art debates that preoccupied so many people for so long might be right or wrong, and I became instead intrigued by the state of mind someone would be in where they would proactively want or feel they needed access to some kind of objectivity in their film commentaries, essays, and reviews. One thing I've heard quite frequently is that without objectivity, objective standards, objective meanings, objective conclusions, anything can be anything, and meaning is lost. My earlier invocation of the omniscience of God probably makes this a bit of an obvious point, but in case you didn't spend vital teenage years arguing about religion on the internet like I did, this is a common theistic defense of the utility of belief in an all-good, all-knowing, and all-powerful creator deity. Usually this comes from Christians where I'm from, frequently evangelicals or self-described fundamentalists, but it can come from others. It is, however, in our culture a distinctly Christian notion. I genuinely believe some of these objectivity debates have developed or at least reproduced a quasi-secular and agnostic theism. God as such is a non-factor, but argumentatively meaning in art functions as it would specifically if the mind of God existed. There is a perfect perspective that offers absolute good and absolute knowledge, or at least we have to act like there is. I imagine creators who speak this way would tend generally to have some overlap with Jordan Peterson's fan base. He makes essentially a number of the same equally spurious arguments. You may also note what even some religious people who have argued with Peterson have noted. There's a kind of insincerity or lack of faith in this argument from utility. This was yet another reason I felt it necessary to spend time discussing the political right, conservatism, and anti-Semitism. Why are so many people compelled to argue about this film in bad faith? Why are so many people compelled to make pretensions to objectivity in judgments of a work of art as good or bad? I felt Sartre had the answer, as discussed previously. Some men appreciate the durability of a stone. That is, they prefer to be unassailable in their arguments. This constitutes a kind of immunity from the truth. This is how some people engage with the idea of truth. I personally find it helpful to remember the meaning of the word falsifiable as a standard in the sciences. Those hypotheses are falsifiable, which are capable of being disproved by evidence. I appreciate the need for a consistent standard, but being accountable to truth means setting yourself up to be subordinated to it. Seeking objective meaning means seeking value judgments capable of subordinating others. It is a way of behaving as if you are not someone's equal. It is bad pedagogy. It is an ego-saving maneuver. A number of videos I've watched recently talked about the response video format or cited Paulo Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed. It's another thing I've been in discussion with others about for years, and finally I believe I've revised my position. We might feel very sure that we're right, and we might even be able to reason that we're right. But what does it matter if what we're interested in is higher learning, and what we're practicing is bad pedagogy? People are often so intent on justifying themselves that they don't see the bigger picture. There is no could versus should distinction when moral or factual certitude is so unyielding. Instead, we need to ask other important questions about our self-serving behavior and the impact that it has on the people around us. I already cited Innuendo Studios once previously in this video series, and this was in part because a book he recommended in his work, The Reactionary Mind, Conservatism from Edmund Burke to Donald Trump by Corey Robin, was as useful to me in developing some of my ideas as Pedagogy of the Oppressed by Paulo Freire had been. I'd like to discuss the latter of those two texts again in an upcoming video essay, but more importantly for now, I'd like to draw attention to a section from another Innuendo Studios video before we finally end this.
Perception is everything. One reason to insist that you're a consumer revolt rather than a harassment campaign is most people who want to harass need someone to give them permission and need someone to tell them that it's normal. Bob Altemeyer has this survey he uses to study authoritarians. He divides respondents into people with low, average, and high authoritarian sentiments, and then he tells them what the survey has measured and asks, what score do you think is best to have? Low, average, or high? People with low authoritarian sentiments say that it's best to be low. People with average authoritarian sentiments say it's also best to be low. But people with high authoritarian sentiments, they say it's best to be average. Altemeyer finds all across his research that reactionaries want to aggress, but only if it is socially acceptable. They want to know that they are the in-group and be told who the out-group is. They don't even particularly care who the out-group is. Altemeyer finds they'll aggress against any group an authority figure points to, even if they don't notice it, a group that contains them. They just have to believe the in-group is the norm.
You've probably heard the take over the years that Gamergate, the subject of that video, never really ended but just evolved. Maybe that's true, but even if it wasn't, the general shape of the matter at hand would still be the same. Notice how many of these creators make pretensions to consumer protectionism, drawing on the tradition of advance reviews for debuting films, shows, or games. This casts any negative energy that exists in their social spaces behind the veil of a consumer revolt. They're insistent that they're the silent majority of the public, or at least the true fans, because this lends the normativity that pretense requires. Pretensions to objectivity and criticism do much the same here. I checked out a digital copy of the Altemeyer book in question and feel it more than validates the claims that Innuendo Studios makes, and remarks that he refers to about a preference for average authoritarian sentiments are particularly instructive given how many of the people we've discussed seem to describe themselves either as former disillusioned moderates, true political centrists, or the apolitical disaffected. I'm sure it's very convenient for someone who masks their behavior behind established norms to describe as being in the center of the political spectrum. There's a couple other things from the Altemeyer book that are probably worth mentioning, but even restraining myself for the sake of brevity, there was a note at one point about fallacious thinking that really drew me in. Altemeyer describes an instance of propositional logic. Premise 1. All fish live in the sea. Premise 2. Sharks live in the sea. Conclusion. Sharks are fish. I'd like you to pause for a moment, if it doesn't trouble you too much, and ask yourself what exactly is wrong with this logic. Ready? Okay, here goes. Taking at face value that all fish live in the sea, and that sharks live in the sea, these claims do not interact to produce the conclusion that sharks are fish. Dolphins live in the sea as well as fish. Are dolphins fish? I imagine some of you intuitively felt the logic was valid, because the conclusion was correct. After all, sharks are fish. However, this was a logic problem, not a problem of incidental facts. Altemeyer suggests that a right-wing authoritarian would be more likely to agree with the proposed logic of that syllogism, despite the fact that its logic does not follow, simply because they would feel the conclusion is correct. In other words, as opposed to the conclusion being validated by the logic, for the right-wing authoritarian, sometimes the logic is validated by the conclusion. This is Sartre's description of bad faith argumentation at work again. The interlocutor will claim any logic is valid provided it serves the claim they believe is true. They are not subordinated to truth. Truth is subordinated to them. This is, ironically, the thing that many of those who yearn for objective meaning seem to have feared all along, and their very way of thinking produces it. They might say, now anything can be true, but the reality is more horrifying. Now only what they require to fuel their worst impulses can be true.
This is why they have to believe games journalism is corrupt because of a handful of feminist media critics with outsized influence. Legitimate failures of journalism cannot be systemic problems rooted in how digital media is funded and consumed. There cannot be a legitimate market for social justice-y media. It has to be manipulation by the few. Because if these things are common, then even if you don't like them, they're normal. They're part of the in-group. Reactionary politics is rebellion against things they dislike being normalized, because they know once they're normalized, they will have to accept them. Because the thing they care about most is being normal. This is why the echo chamber. This is why Fox News. This is why the far right insists they're a silent majority. This is why they artificially inflate their numbers. This is why they insist facts are bias. They have to maintain the image that what are, in material terms, fringe beliefs are, in fact, held by the majority. This is why getting mocked by Stephen Colbert was such a blow to Gamergate. It made it harder to believe that the world at large agreed with them. This is why if you're trying to change the world for the better, it's pointless to ask for their permission.
I believe that with the continued fixation on wokeness in geek fandom media, this continues to be relevant. The Last Jedi discourse was, regardless of what you think of the film, a sort of staging ground for a revamp of the Gamergate model of online engagement, and despite its peaks and valleys, it remains alive and well. For his purposes, Innuendo Studios asked, why video games? This was basically my question too. Why The Last Jedi to begin with? Why The Last Jedi at all? The answer is the same. A better question is why not? As previously quoted, Corey Robin talks about how the invasion of egalitarianism and liberatory politics into the private life of power, or what some of you might conceive of as the comfort zone of privilege as a kind of privileged habitus, can cause someone who was previously in favor of that justice to disregard it entirely. This is the sliver of truth in the claim that these fandom properties are having politics pushed into them, and this is why the retort that those properties weren't always political doesn't land. The reactionary is noticing not the change in the property that they openly name, but the change in how it makes them feel implicated, a more vulnerable feeling that is also more difficult to openly confront. This is why video games, and this is why The Last Jedi, or comic books, or Warhammer 40k, or Super Mario, or The Lord of the Rings. This is the consistent dynamic at play. Fandoms are, in this light, being experienced through one's private life via the norms of established power, and violations of those norms must be fought lest they become the new norms. This is the danger. Anti-Semitism often manifests along the previously discussed lines as structural anti-Semitism, the general view that a small cabal of elites is rigging our social system to their benefit. The reality that all participants exist by necessity of the system's structures often goes unstated. That is effectively what happened in Gamergate in the terms Innuendo Studios describes. The proposed idyllic boys' club that never existed except for public perception was more comfortable as an illusion, so an alternative explanation of a small group of people trying to manipulate things was needed. This is also how many content creators these days talk about properties going woke despite going broke, because there needs to be an agenda. The message needs to be real to explain why companies are acting outside their financial incentive. The reality is, of course, that they are acting within their financial incentives, but to admit to that fact while maintaining one's priors would be to admit to a problem with capitalism. And what are we, a bunch of godless commies? This is why anti-Semitism instead of anti-capitalism. This is why transphobia instead of feminism. This is why anti-wokeness instead of anti-racism. Reactionaries are engaged in a fetishistic disavowal of a system they refuse to condemn and for which they require a scapegoat. That battle will be never-ending unless they lose, because its proposed solutions are incapable of addressing its causes. They're supposed to be incapable of addressing its causes. That's the reason why they exist. Star Wars is being politicized, but it's not because it wasn't political or because it secretly was, and it's not because a few people are manipulating it for their benefit. Star Wars is being politicized by reactionaries to defend themselves from what they already know. Of course, the other perspective is that marginalized people are attempting to become one's equals and gain better lives for themselves and for those with whom they seek equality. In doing so, they are automatically framed as the aggressors. Selling affirmations of that aggressive framing is not only profitable, but also probably compatible with the views of a number of content creators who will likely self-select to one degree or another for how willing they are to go along with it. Whether they believe it or not, the posture is the point. The rules of the game begin to serve their objectives as determined by incentive structures and psychological instincts. So we arrive at a point where an awful lot of people are arguing the same conspicuously poorly reasoned talking points almost by rote, because the goal was and always has been the self-soothing of the agitation in private life, and the opportunistic exploitation of ignorance by greed. We cannot return to the past. We cannot age backwards into the womb. Everything will always, in some regard or another, appear less innocent and fresh than it was when we were children, and increasingly emotions become burdened and entangled with grief, trauma, and strife. If we allow ourselves to become jaded, fixated on that unattainable thing, then like a mirage, it misleads us. We wander off the path of self-growth, and it is precisely that kind of stunted person who gets exploited by the kind of material we've been discussing. There's more going on here than just differences of fan opinion, and if we're not careful, we'll be manipulated not just by people, but by algorithms and social forces, for which it is difficult to hold individuals responsible, but with which we are collectively involved. But developing my views on these issues sincerely has come with the caveat of changing my views on what exactly I'm doing here. I've become pretty dissatisfied as a creative with the format of response videos, the limitations of unscripted or react content, and the seemingly near inextricable problems of political content and discourses online. I've always had a passion for learning about social issues and philosophy, and I don't think that will ever change. But what happens when, considering the poor pedagogy of these spaces and how I feel my own work inadequately addresses it, means I have to make a tough change? I don't intend this to be an indictment of anyone else, but rather just a description of what I value, what I want to do to act in accordance with those values, and how I think I need to behave in order to do it. I think I've learned what I can about videos about The Last Jedi, and similarly, I think I've become dissatisfied making political rebuttals, or even any unscripted content for YouTube. The funny thing is, I watch a lot of content like that, but in order to challenge myself, I want to grow in a different direction, and truly that will mean some growing pains of consequence. I plan on writing a community post about this change in my direction, but because my other reasons beyond what I've talked about here are kind of private and the type of thing I'm not yet willing to post about on the internet, I want to keep things blissfully on topic here. Beyond thinking about my health and my need for focus on other practical concerns from work to family, I want to create more high-effort scripted material that resolves the pedagogical problems that I've been talking about from the other end. I want to create content that provokes thought in a positive way and builds up our ability to think critically as opposed to focusing strictly on debunks or refutations. Other creators do that already, and for some time now I've been feeling pulled towards another kind of engagement. The way I see it, I need to do what's best not just for my health and life, but for my creative spirit, because in the long run, that's also what's best for this space and what's best for you all too, provided I'm building out my understanding of the theoretical basis of our knowledge of media and philosophy and politics. I think a better pedagogy for YouTube on my part begins with being more proactive, creating more work that takes control of the conversation on my own terms, and delivers a more humanizing perspective. I want to be known more for the positivity I create than the negativity I denounce. You might say that's how we're going to win. Not by destroying what we hate, but by saving what we love. I'm obviously not swearing off writing about political ideas ever. I'll probably do it all the time. Or responding to anybody else at all, maybe once in a blue moon. But I want to channel that energetic impulse into something that feels more constructive to me. This is not the end, but rather a beautiful little beginning. Every night, our old self lies down, and every morning our new self wakes up for a brand new day, and just like that, I will see you all again soon in beautiful new ways. Until then, I would like to leave you with some words that have given me peace of mind in a new direction, and which feel like a perfect end to this discussion. Who suffer the effects of oppression more than the oppressed? who can better understand the necessity of liberation. They will not gain this liberation by chance, but through the praxis of their quest for it, through their recognition of the necessity to fight for it. And this fight, because of the purpose given it by the oppressed, will actually constitute an act of love, opposing the lovelessness which lies at the heart of the oppressor's violence, lovelessness even when clothed in false generosity. Paulo Freire. The dark is generous, and it is patient, and it always wins. But in the heart of its strength lies weakness. One lone candle is enough to hold it back. Love is more than a candle. Love can ignite the stars. Matthew Stover.